I'm excited for our conversation today. And look, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm not very good at naming these things. I kind of struggle with that, and it usually ends up being something goofy, or I go for the easy alliteration, lasting leadership lessons. And in fact, I kind of cheated. Any announcement you got about this had lasting leadership lessons in it, but I added, and this is kind of what I wish we had called it, I added for our purposes here the timely and the timeless. And let me tell you the impetus or the motivation for our discussion today. So much of what we've talked about already in these off-the-shelf series, in these webinars, and so much, every morning I wake up and my inbox is filled with advertisements or solicitations from various training companies or other things about how to do, how to lead during a pandemic, how to train during a pandemic, how to lead virtually, how to do that, and I get that. And that's important to know. Because the world is different now than it was maybe just 7 or 8 months ago. It certainly is. But I'm also still interested in those things that transcend our current circumstances. Let's say the pandemic ended tomorrow. What's critical for us to know? And so what I think we're going to talk about today, or what we are going to talk about today that I think will resonate with you, I should say, is these things that kind of transcend the moment, but also, if applied, are very relevant and will help our leadership efforts, even if we're leading virtually, even if we're leading in a pandemic, even if our work worlds and our personal lives have been kind of turned upside down. These things still consistently matter. And so what I'm going to ask from you today is, again, look, if given a choice between doing a webinar or facilitating a conversation live, I would always choose live. And because there's the interaction and there's the application, the exercise portion of that. Well, we don't have a ton of opportunity for that today, right? We simply don't have the time. So I'm going to ask, and hopefully I'll remember to stop at certain points. And I want you to reflect and say, okay, of these things that we've talked about, what is it that I think is something that I'm strong at? What is it that I think I need to work on? If you will hold yourself accountable for considering and being introspective about those kinds of things, I think our time will be better spent. Okay, so let's jump into this lasting leadership lessons, the timely and the timeless. What are we going to talk about? Well, you've seen this when you signed up for the course, so I don't want to spend too much time going over this, but we will talk. Those first 3 bullet points we'll go through fairly quickly, and then we will spend most of our time on the 4th bullet point on how to become an authentic transformational leader. But we cannot disregard the first 3 things about leadership development and all the money that's spent on that. This interesting conversation that always comes up, this classic conversation about management and leadership, and how do we know if it's a good fit between the leader and the organization? Those kinds of things before we get to the meatiest part of our conversation. But this is what we're going to spend our time chatting about today. Okay. So why is it that leadership development efforts seem to not have the intended impact? Well, I've shared this with some of you recently. Here's some interesting data from Chief Learning Officer from just a couple months ago. So 200 billion has been spent on leadership development globally across the world. Look, people are going to, not as much live anymore, but people are going to trainings, and they're going through coaching, and they're doing webinars, and all this money is being spent on developing leadership. Yet Fortune magazine reported that 10%, only 10% of CEOs report that their leadership development efforts are actually impacting their business, their bottom line in clear and effective ways. 10%, okay? Look at McKinsey, the consulting firm. 11% of 500 executives polled from around the globe, right, say that they agreed with the statement that their leadership development interventions achieve and sustain the results that they desire. Think about that for a second. Given all that money and all the time and energy we spend on this, and by the way, it's a bottomless well. I've been in this field for long enough now to know it's never going away. There's never a point where people say, you know what, we're pretty good on our leadership now. We don't need any more training or coaching or development. We're good. I've never seen that happen. Right, and that's probably a good thing, right? Because we would say, well, leaders are never complacent, et cetera, et cetera. So why is it, though, that there is this data that we keep sending people to training, and yet we keep not having either the business impact or the actual leadership progress that we want to see. Well, I have a couple suggestions, and a lot of you have heard me say this before. The problem is, very often when we do leadership development interventions, consulting, training, coaching, those kinds of things, it is an outside-in approach versus an inside-out approach. In other words, if I'm learning a trade, I can go and receive certification and I get knowledge on how to do something, and I can certify, yeah, I know how to use this piece of equipment now, or I know how to use this computer program, right? I'm certified in it. But leadership doesn't work that way, but we still develop it that way often. It's like, okay, you got promoted, Jane or Jim, and now we're going to send you to leadership training, and they're going to, from the outside in, impose this leadership knowledge on you, where authentic transformational leadership doesn't really operate that way. It should be inside out, right? So what we try to do on the leadership development team at DHRM, as much as we can, is say, well, forget about this sort of information overload or knowledge overload that we're going to put on you. What already exists inside of you? And what is your current context, and how can we merge those things together to bring out this organic leadership that exists in you? And that's what I've got here, knowing versus being. Knowing is great. That kind of what we call epistemological approach is great for a new certification, the technical programs, but being, or an ontological approach, is really what's effective for lasting development of leadership. Now, I had the opportunity to go to Italy in 2019, March of 2019. And we went to Florence and we saw the statue David that you see on the screen before you. And I'll be honest with you, I was not prepared to be impressed by this. And it was terribly, it was awe-inspiring. It didn't disappoint. But along the corridor that leads to this dome room with the statue David is Michelangelo's Freeing the Prisoners. And it's all this kind of unfinished work that he's done, because as you know, as Michelangelo worked with sculpture, he just said he saw what was in the marble and he chiseled away and brought it out. Well, and you see that in various stages as you go to his masterpiece, David, which is kind of us as a finished leader. Where we're at various stages along the way. We are more like these freeing the prisoners. We are trying to develop as leaders and bring out that which is in us organically, naturally, and slowly but surely we discover that, we chip away at the marble until ideally one day maybe we resemble something like that, the masterpiece is the statue David. So until organizations understand that leadership cannot be imposed, leadership development and knowledge can't be imposed on people, you're going to see the numbers that we continue to see every year, by the way. Every year something comes out. X amount of millions or billions spent on leadership, and people, still unhappy with it. Well, yeah, we've got to take a different approach. And I like this metaphor of the freeing the prisoners until we get to that statue David. It's really a wonderful thing to see how Michelangelo actually operated. I think leadership development's the same way. So the question is, and by the way, this has been asked for years, is can leadership be taught? Well, I don't know. I'm not entirely comfortable saying that leadership can be taught. What I'm more comfortable saying, like Michelangelo's Freeing the Prisoners, is leadership can be discovered. So here's where we sometimes make the mistake of we look too narrowly at what leadership is. So you've got here this cycle here, or this imagery of what leadership is. Leadership as a process. And there are people that occupy various roles in this process. The problem is, look at that first one, the leader. We tend to look at that and say, okay, that's our unit of analysis. That's what we study. That's what we work on. It's like, well, yeah, but that leadership only exists if in the right context, if there are followers, and you could throw any number of things up here, but I put shared values, purpose, and meaning. So what do I mean by this? Right? We'll spend more time on this, but by definition, if someone is going to be a leader, there has to be followers. There have to be people that voluntarily say, I'm going to follow you. You are worthy of my followership, right? The other thing that I would say is context matters. And this is especially important as we look at organization and leadership and leader fit. There are people that you work with that you would never peg as a leader. That you'd just be like, no, they don't have it. right? They don't have it. But if you were to see them in their communities, if you were to see them in their civic roles, if you were to see them in their religious communities, or if you were to see them in their families, you would say, oh my gosh, they would floor you at how much of a leader they are. And that's why this context is critical here too. So no, I don't think leadership can be taught, but what you and I should be striving to do every day if we are leaders or aspiring leaders is to discover our leadership. And that's kind of that leads to the second question is, so are leaders born or made? Well, and the answer is that the research says, yes, they are born and they are made because it depends on the context, right? The good news is, by the way, there are a lot of people that will say, no, some people just have it. Well, there's no question that certain people, intelligence, drive, energy, wisdom, lots of things, they might have that, they might be born with that more maybe than others. Charisma, things like that. Yeah, no question, some people are born with that, but the evidence is overwhelming. Unlike what we used to think hundreds of years ago, when we thought that in order to be a leader, you had to be a tall male, okay, there is no leader personality type. Okay, now that's important to know. Again, think about the context here too, and think about the followers. Maybe some people respond to the very outgoing, gregarious, charismatic leader, but there are other people that turns off, and they don't want to be a follower to that kind of leader. But there's no question, the evidence is overwhelming. You've seen it, I've seen it. We can also develop as leaders. We can discover leadership more. So we take that which we are naturally born with, our natural values, and that which we've learned and been socialized with over the years, and we find the right leader context, hopefully. Hopefully that's the agency for the state of Utah you're working for now. There's enough there that you can find that you say, yeah, I can be a leader here. And then we find those that have shared values, purpose, and meaning. Sometimes, this is critical, we persuade, right, others to adopt some of our values, purpose, and meaning. We help them see how this is meaningful to them, and they become followers. And then you've got leadership in existence. Okay? Now, it frustrates me to no end that I cannot see your faces right now, nor that we have a ton of time to interact. Because then I can say if this is resonating or not. But I want us to think of leadership more holistically as a process in which leaders play a role, followers play a role, and the environment, the context, the organization, the institution plays a role in determining whether or not leadership exists. Okay? So what is the relationship between management and leadership? Man, this comes up every time. And let me tell you my experience. I've done this exercise, and I'm not the only one. Lots of leadership consultants do this, but with groups from literally all across the country. And of course, those of you that have had training from me before, we've had this conversation, where you make a list and you say, okay, tell me the difference between management and leadership. And really what it comes down to is on the management side, they say really boring, kind of crappy stuff. And on the leadership side, they say really cool, awesome stuff. That's usually what ends up happening. But and not that that's untrue, right? Or that it's wrong, but I'm not sure. I think sometimes we treat this discussion as simplistically, okay? So first, let's acknowledge something here. What do we mean by management? I love this definition. J.A. Anderson, 2010, did an interesting study on the distinctions between private and public sector management. But at any point, he said, look, acknowledging there are some commonalities, right? So whether you're a manager in the private or public sector, your job is to accomplish goals for an organization through other people. I love that definition for what a manager is. You're trying to get stuff done for an organization, an agency, through other people that you're responsible for. That's management. Okay. Now, the problem with defining leadership and seeing how these relate is there are almost as many definitions for leadership as there are people who want to define it. You know this, right? There's a million leadership books out there. What do we mean by this? Okay. Let me just say one thing here quickly in our discussion about the relationship with management and leadership. It's not wrong. But again, I think it might be too simplistic because always someone will say, oh my gosh, you don't have to have a position to be a leader. You don't have to be a manager. You don't have to be in charge to be a leader. And that's all that there's no question that's true. What I would suggest is that in an organizational in a hierarchical or especially bureaucratic environment, and by the way, we don't like that word, but everyone here today works in a bureaucratic environment. That's okay. It's not by itself a bad thing. The optimal dynamic is when, think about the roles here, you've got someone who holds formal authority, like manager, when you've got someone who holds formal authority, also occupying the leader role. Now, that doesn't mean those roles don't sometimes switch, and it doesn't mean that followers or employees always are followers and they're never leaders. Don't get me wrong, it's not that clean cut. But I want you to hear what I'm saying again. I think it works optimally in an organization where there is hierarchy, and most organizations have some degree of hierarchy, when those who hold formal authority also act as leaders. It is chaos when, think about this, it's a really bad organization if the managers had no leadership expertise, right, or capacity. The other problem, right, is if there's no leadership anywhere, non-formal authority, formal authority, no one's exercising leadership, that's chaos. That's a terrible work environment. So what we're going for here is whether you are a manager now or in the future, okay, we are hoping that you will also exercise leadership. Now, here's the good news. These things are not mutually exclusive. It's interesting, there's some literature out there that says that someone who's a manager and someone who's a leader, these are actually very different people. That's nonsense. Okay, we want people, you can be a manager and a leader. In fact, that's what our discussion is going to be about today, is how do you do that? Now, here's what I like as a definition for leadership. Peter Drucker, kind of the management guru of the 20th century, said the only definition of a leader is someone who has followers. Think of our cycle that we showed, context, leader, follower. You are a leader if someone says you are a leader. I will follow you. At that moment, you become a leader, regardless of position, whatever else it is. So the question is then, can we be managers and leaders? And we always get this question about what's the relationship between management and leadership? Are they the same thing? Are they different? Well, I would pose to you, if the only definition of a leader is someone who has followers, I think there's a better question. And that better question is, what's the difference between employees and followers? By definition, a leader has to have followers and managers have employees. Now, again, just as being a manager and a leader, those are not mutually exclusive roles, neither are employees and followers. So what is the difference between employees and followers? Well, to go through this quickly, quite frankly, if someone is an employee, and I want to be careful with my words here, someone is an employee only. They're not a follower. In other words, they only see you as the manager, not a leader. They're in this relationship for the exchange. I will do the work you tell me to, and you will pay me and give me benefits. And you will try to give me as little as possible. And think about this for a second. What will they try and do? They will try and give you as little as possible, versus the follower that is engaged, right? That says, yeah, I am going to voluntarily allow you to be the leader. And in that, because of that, I'm going to give my whole self to this position, as opposed to just minimal effort that the employee gives. We see that the follower gives discretionary effort. They're giving their whole selves to a role rather than that minimal economic exchange, right? That minimal effort that comes in economic exchange. The employee has low commitment. A better thing comes along, they're gone, right? The follower has high commitment. They want to stay because they are engaged. They see that they're part of that leadership process. And so they have high commitment to the organization or to the team. And there's less team focus for the employee. In other words, they don't care about their coworkers. It's like, I'm in this for me. There's the exchange. I'm going to get what I can and get out. Versus the follower has more team focus, cares about the cohesion on the team, the success of the team. And very interestingly enough, the employee that is, again, an employee only is less creative. They're not thinking innovatively about what to bring to work, and the follower is more creative. And finally, if someone is an employee only, they are more likely to engage in what we call workplace deviant behaviors, gossip, even petty theft from an organization, backbiting, negative attitudes, whereas followers have, they feel like they're citizens of the organization or the team. And we see organizational citizenship behaviors, promoting the organization, encouraging others, supporting people when they can, even being more tolerant of mistakes that the organization makes or changes that they make. So if I'm listening to this today, my question is, not only how do I move from being a manager only to becoming a leader? how do I get employees to become followers? That to me is a more spot on question. Okay, so here's our model of how we do this. Some of you, of course, have seen this before, right? We're going to talk about this. It's called, how to become a transformational leader. Well, transactional leadership, I hope this is visible to you. At the bottom of your screen there's laissez-faire, management by exception, and contingent reward. We'll talk about these. And then to be a transformational leader, you've got the 4 I's of transformational leadership. And we'll talk about those 4 I's. I'm going to get a little help from some of our participants to talk us through some of those 4 I's. But let me just tell you right now, if we're going to talk about the dichotomy, if we're going to treat management leadership dichotomously, the transactional that you see there on the screen, that's management. And that's not bad. Management's good. And we want better management. We do, right? The 4 I's are what we would call leadership, okay? And another way of looking at this. So you've got transactional leadership on the left side there, or management, bottom left. Contingent reward, management by exception. Let me explain that quickly. All that is management by exception is you get involved and you start managing when you notice bad performance or exceptional performance. Something goes wrong, you go in and you get involved. Contingent reward is just what it sounds like. You make X amount of widgets, I reward you, either with attaboys or bonuses or the paycheck itself. Well, here's what's interesting. The evidence says that transactional leadership done well, and I would suggest that there are good managers, take leadership out of it. There are good managers out there and there are bad managers that don't even do these things well. But done well, transactional leadership or management will get you the expected outcomes. In fact, I'm telling you right now, there are executive directors that would kill to have just effective transactional management or leadership happening in their organizations and getting the expected outcomes, right? They would love to have that. But if we're going to be real leaders, and I believe this, by the way, and transform our teams and transform our agencies, then that's when transformational leadership, the 4 I's that we'll talk about, comes in, and that's when we get performance beyond expectations. Okay, and that's why you and I knowing how to adopt these 4 I's is absolutely critical. So the question you're asking now is, okay, Dan, we've heard this leadership, by the way, out of my own mouth. Many of you have heard me spout this stuff for over a decade now. You've heard it from others, right? Does it really make a difference? Well, this was from a meta-analysis of the studies on transformational leadership, right? And won't go through this whole thing, but look at this. Judged 1 year later, if people rated their leader as being a transformational leader, they were more profitable 5 years later, okay? And a review of 87 studies testing transformational leadership found it was related to the motivation and satisfaction of followers and the higher performance and perceived effectiveness of leaders. That's out of a textbook I taught out of. Well, Peter Northaus, who's a leadership professor and has published a lot on this, looked at the same meta-analysis and said, oh, by the way, okay, because your next question is, yeah, but does this apply to the state of Utah? That's talking about R&D firms, other things. Peter Northaus said, these findings are true for higher and lower level leaders, we'll talk about that, and for leaders in both public and private settings. So there's no question that you and I believe this, in the state of Utah, we face obstacles and challenges to exercising leadership, to creating that leadership cycle that we'd like to, context, follower, leader. We face challenges that sometimes other industries or other sectors, they don't face. I get that. But I do believe we also have opportunities that maybe they don't have. And the evidence is that transformational leadership works for both. So here's our model again as we jump into this, okay? A full range of leadership model. We're going to go through the 4 I's together, okay? And by the way, you'll notice that these 4 I's, there's no particular order. If I am you listening to this now, and I want to not have my hour that I spend on this webinar be a waste of time, I am saying, okay, what are the 4 I's? How do I better adopt them into my current leadership practice? Okay, so let's first start with individual consideration. Individual consideration is kind of what it sounds like. It's, do you show appreciation for people? It's are you taking opportunities to recognize them for the work that they do? The evidence, by the way, is overwhelming that it is not happening nearly enough in our organizations. Do you have a good personal relationship as desired by the employee, right? Do you coach them? Do you teach them to be their best selves? And do you see the whole person? Do you let them bring their whole selves to work? Now, I went through that really quickly, but I'm hoping you'll get the gist of what I'm talking about. I want to bring Kelly Whalen. If you'll unmute yourself for a second. Um, Talk to us a little bit about these kinds of things, about individual consideration. Why do you think this matters? What have you seen in your own experiences and organizations of why this stuff matters?
Sure, Dan. Thanks for letting me join today. So I am a huge, huge fan of gratitude in the workplace, and really showing rather than telling sometimes your employees how wonderful they are, and that you sincerely and authentically appreciate them. So in our last all hands meeting, I passed out 5x7 fluorescent cards, and I asked all of our employees, take 2 minutes and write something kind about your coworkers. Just take this time, and it could be, hey, I really appreciated your help on the team meeting last week, or, I really love that you bring laughter into our workplace and kind of bring some levity to the situations that we face. So I took that and I gathered up all the cards and I created a gratitude board in my own office. And I utilized that to kind of share these sentiments of our employees with their employees on weekly emails. And the amount of joy and gratitude that brought not only to our team, but also myself, I think helped. Oh, sure. Sorry, hi. So now I can actually show you. So these are the cards that I had our employees fill out. And I used it as kind of a launch pad to facilitate not only gratitude, but conversation. And I genuinely think that bolsters not only the team, but when I walk into my office and I see our gratitude board, it reminds me of why I'm here, and that you do make an impact to the employees that you work with.
So is it fair to say, Kelly, then, because there are some people that listening to this will be like, oh, that's not me. I can't do that, that sort of thing. But is it your opinion that there was actually, I'm not going to say like, oh, how do we measure bottom line difference, but you could feel a difference in people's interactions with each other, the dynamic or just the environment because of an exercise like that?
Yes, absolutely. And I do think it's simple in nature, right? Just telling
Mhm.
somebody thank you is so simple, but the reward is fantastic. It reaps just gains for everybody involved. And I got to thinking, because everybody's working remotely, so this might not work in your office right now, but a tool you guys could utilize is Trello. It's essentially like a Post-it note board digitally. So you could create a digital gratitude board for your teams on that. And yeah, hope it's helpful.
No, that's awesome. Thank you, Kelly. And by the way, I should tell people that are listening, I cheat a little because the people that are participating, just like the last webinar I did where I had people involved, I go to people that I know kind of this is a strength of theirs because I've either through their colleagues or through coaching or training. And so this happens to be a strength of Kelly's, right? She does this stuff really well. The other thing I would say that, and we're going through these really quickly, but this idea of relationships at work matter. Now, you cannot force people to be friends at work. You cannot force people to like each other, but there's science behind this that says you can better create the conditions that are likely to facilitate relationships at work, interpersonal, collegial relationships, friendly relationships at work. And that's partly what we just heard from Kelly. Right. So thank you for that. By the way, look from Ron Friedman here. By the way, that picture is not of Ron Friedman. I'll explain who that is in a second. Ron Friedman wrote a book that I'm going to suggest to you here in a second. He says, and this is interesting evidence, when employees experience loneliness, they grow more disconnected from their colleagues, their ability to focus deteriorates, and their desires to succeed plummets. So basically, he says, if I don't have friends at work, I'm not as good at my job. And by the way, it's not just Ron Friedman, but we see this over and over and over. In fact, Kouzes and Posner, who wrote the Leadership Challenge, many of you have seen, have said, look, if you report that your boss is your friend, you're 2.5 times more likely to be satisfied with your job. Think about that for a second. Okay, so this individual consideration stuff matters to transformational leadership. And that picture you see there is of Herb Kelleher, founder of Southwest Airlines, and he's passed, right? But he was famous for creating an environment where people could bring their whole selves to work, and making a work environment in as serious an industry as airline travel made it fun, right? And so I love Herb Kelleher as an example of individual consideration. Okay. By the way, I'm going to do this after each one. Here's a book that I recommend to you. You'll recognize that name, Ron Friedman. The Best Place to Work. I love this book. I don't normally recommend books to people, but this is one when lately people ask me, hey, what should I be reading? I immediately turn them to this. I would love to see our agencies adopt so much of what he demonstrates as empirically valuable in this book to creating workplaces that are awesome. And in a lot of cases, there's no reason we couldn't adopt these things, but he covers a lot of individual consideration in this book, okay? So now the next one, idealized influence. This is, if I'm going to put this in a nutshell, this is you are a leader, or you've got credibility with people because you personify the shared values. They trust you. They have seen you walk the talk. And the other thing is there were authenticity. That's what came up. That term came up for me earlier. It came up from Kelly as she talked about authentically showing gratitude to colleagues and employees. The other thing here that I would say, self-sacrifice. What does that mean? Self-sacrifice for a leader is almost, and I hear this every time I have a leadership conversation with people, is, are you willing to be in the trenches with me? If the crap hits the fan, so to speak, are you willing to roll up your sleeves, manager, person who holds a formal authority, and get down in the trenches with us? That would be a form of self-sacrifice that people see. And this idealized influence, you'll see later, might be, now there's no order to these things, okay? And I don't want to put one over the other, but I would suggest, and some of the feedback that you gave us in that survey I sent out, is that this matters immensely, maybe more than anything. So Mike, if you would unmute yourself for a second. Again, these people that I've asked to share, I hope they're flattered that I picked them for these things. But Mike, who I know has uber credibility with people, talk to us a little bit about this idea of idealized influence, why it matters so much, or how you've seen it, or how you've exercised it.
Hey, good morning, Dan. Thank you, and good morning to everybody. And yes, I am flattered to participate, so thanks for this opportunity. As I was thinking about this, Dan, I thought I'd share do a compare and a contrast. Years ago, many years ago, I observed a manager who proudly announced this open door policy. Anybody, any frontline staff could stop in and visit at any time. And the manager put on quite a show that he was interested in what staff had to say, when in fact, under the surface, he was really just irritated by the interruption. And I get, leaders are busy, but instead of using this as an opportunity to visit and build relationships, the information gathered during those visits was often used to undermine the staff's supervisor. It was a black mark against their professionalism of the supervisor. And this manager just would not forget, because after all, if the supervisor was doing a good job leading, the staff would not be in this manager's office in the first place, interrupting them. Now, I contrast that with somebody that I considered a mentor, somebody that retired from our agency several years ago after a full career in the Air Force. So he brought with him this, what I call consistent authenticity. He had humility, diligence, optimism, hope, confidence. If anybody has worked with him, his name was James Whitaker, you know what I'm talking about. The thing that I learned from James was when somebody went into his office to visit, he would physically stop and turn from the computer and face the individual. If his desk phone rang, he ignored it. If his cell phone rang, he ignored that. If he got an instant message, he ignored it. The person that was in the office was the most important person at the time. He was a leader that, to me, walked the talk. He was a role model of these positive leadership values. And as a result, those of us who had the opportunity to work around him, we trusted him. And he was able to influence our division and others in a positive manner. he had a quote that he would often share from Helen Keller that said, "Optimism is the faith that leads to achievement. Nothing can be done without hope and confidence." And he just emulated that. So in my mind, when I think of idealized influence, James Whitaker was somebody who really epitomized that.
And by the way, can I just share with everybody that we don't rehearse these? I've asked these people to participate, given them a hey, I'd like you to talk about this, but I'm not sure I could. That compare and contrast is absolutely perfect. Maybe a sociopath or something. I'm probably using that wrong. No one's going to say, hey, by the way, I don't care about any of you and I will never listen to you. We're all going to say the right things when we get that formal position that would allow us to fill the leader role. Right. And yet the person who said, oh, open door, but they lose credibility because people are like, yeah, right. You don't really feel that way. You don't really want to hear from me, versus the person that talk the talk and then walk the walk, or walk that same talk, right? And saying, no, you matter, and I'm going to show you that you matter. I love that example. And thank you, Mike. That's perfect. So those of you listening, what you need to do is kind of do an inventory here. What are the shared values that you have as a team, or the values that you claim to be about? And then how are you doing with it? What are the behaviors where maybe you're not even meaning to violate these values? In other words, maybe like, oh my gosh, I tell my people that, that they matter, but then I have this kind of keep my door shut, or, whatever it is. Really be introspective and say, are there things, or ask, right? Or ask others and say, what is it? What are our shared values? And then how am I doing with that? I don't know where all of these are important, but I don't know if there's anything that's going to last with and stick with people as much as you claiming to be about something and then really being about it, assuming that claiming to be about is good, right? Claiming, you have these shared values and then you personify it, that'll make someone a follower. For sure, right? And that's why, by the way, that is not a picture of Mary Parker Follett. I love Mary Parker Follett. She was a leadership and management guru in the 20s and 30s, never got the credit she deserved. She was a woman in the 20s and 30s. But she's been called the prophet of management because she was so ahead of her time. But this is the best leaders does not ask people to serve him or her, but the common end. They've got people they're not followers, right? But men and women working with him or her. So, again, we're using the term followers, but it's oh, come with me on this, and I will come with you, right? There's that self-sacrifice again. Who you see in front of you here is Haruka Nishimatsu, a former CEO of JAL, Japan Airlines, was a top 10 international airline. Well, when the economic downturn happened, you know what he did? He cut his, again, top 10 airline. He cut his salary, so he was making about as much as his pilots, the average of what his pilots were making. Obviously, before he was making much more. He cut all of his corporate perks, his CEO perks. And there's an interesting CNN story from, a decade ago now or so on Haruka Nishimatsu. But you talk about engendering followership and demonstrating leadership. You look at a time where, other, when they were getting bailouts, some other CEOs were flying in their private jets to meeting with Congress, to their meetings with Congress. He was taking the bus and he was eating in the company lunchroom, et cetera, et cetera. So be a Haruka Nishimatsu, right, or a Whitaker that Mike Miller talked about. All right, now another book recommendation here for idealized influence. It's called True North. Bill George, he's out of Harvard, is kind of the guy in my mind and he's got a number of books, but True North is one on authentic leadership, that term that keeps coming up. True North is one that you may want to check out. Okay. All right. Next, we've got intellectual stimulation. Now, this is kind of a funny one, but it's this idea that leaders, transformational leaders, that are going to be more than just really effective managers, who want to transform their agency, transform their teams, transform the people that they're trying to serve. They think innovatively. They look, they're not held hostage as so many of us are. We fall into this trap without even knowing that we are. We become almost hypnotized by that's how we've always done it here. Even if most of us are not going to make the mistake of saying that. But these leaders go out of their way to kind of shatter the shackles of that's how we've always done it, including even in bureaucratic, heavily rule-laden environments that we work in. There are always better ways of doing things, always new ways of looking at things. And so you question the status quo. And by the way, these kinds of leaders, they tolerate mistakes. What do I mean by mistakes? Well, not every kind of mistake, right? There's lots of mistakes. We don't say, hey, good job harassing your coworkers, right? Not those kind of mistakes. But they tolerate mistakes that are made in the pursuit of a better way of doing things, if that makes sense. Okay. So let me bring in Jen Larson here. If you'll unmute yourself for a second. Talk to us a little bit about this idea of intellectual stimulation, this idea of you or others, or what leaders can do to look at things in a different way. If you want to share a little bit with us.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I don't know if anyone else feels like this, but I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose a little bit today, and it's been great. I've been furiously taking notes. So I appreciate Dan inviting me to just talk for a few minutes on this. One of the things that our agency has noticed, much to our chagrin, is that we have been taking an outside-in approach of leadership. And one of the issues that we've come up with, and we're trying to help our supervisors, because they're the direct connection to our front line, our most valuable resource, is the whole idea of being able to distinguish between a technical problem and an adaptive challenge. Oftentimes, so I'm from child welfare, and oftentimes in our work, our problems are really, really complex. We're dealing with a lot of human relationships and human emotion. And so the issues can be quite complex and a little bit tricky to navigate. And oftentimes, our staff come to supervisors and they want a technical solution to an adaptive challenge. And our supervisors feel a lot of pressure, because they're in a position of significant authority, that they will want, that they have to produce this technical solution to this really kind of complex adaptive challenge. And so one of the things that we have been coaching our supervisors to do over the last about year and a half is to really sit with the conflict, to be able to really explore with the employee, to help them think critically about all of the potential answers to their adaptive challenge. Because oftentimes there's many solutions that our staff could choose from, but there's no real clear solution for them. And so being able to help that employee navigate some of these really kind of treacherous waters that they could find themselves in is one of the skills that we really feel like supervisors want to be able to establish and really come to have inherently within themselves, to help those staff be able to think about these situations and be able to sort of like learn over time how potentially one solution to one family or one issue is different than a family in a similar situation or area of their life. So that's one of the things, and we pull a lot from Ron Heifetz in his perspectives on change. So, I love this quote from him, is when you obtain a position of significant authority, people inevitably expect you to treat adaptive challenges as if they were technical, to provide a remedy that will restore equilibrium with the least amount of pain and in the shortest amount of time. That puts an enormous amount of pressure to have an answer rather than raise and sit with the really tough questions. So it's one of the things when I coach supervisors that we really talk about, how do they sit in this sort of uncomfortable space with their employee and navigate these really complex situations and relationships. And then who else do they need to bring in with that? And recognize that because of the complexity of our system, that there has to be a tolerance for a worker maybe not selecting a solution that would be better for a particular family that we're working with, and being able to help them be able to navigate that space. So those are a couple of things that we've been really working on over the last about 18 months.
Yeah, I love that. Especially, you'll notice if you're listening to Jen too, this idea she's really talking about in a lot of ways, this idea of engage others in this process. And it seems to me, Jen, that maybe as you talk about Ron Heifetz, and that's a name, folks, if you're listening, you'll want to know. He's out of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and talks a lot about adaptive versus technical problems and solutions to change. I think so many leaders are afraid, they feel like they will lose credibility if they can't simply say, oh, I've got the answer, I've got the solution to this problem, that's why I'm in this position. And it's disingenuous, right? And it's not effective. I like this idea of engaging others because as Jen pointed out, everybody, and thank you, Jen, that was awesome. As Jen pointed out, you start to get ideas and perspectives that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So this idea of intellectual stimulation doesn't happen unless you're going to get other people to start thinking critically too. And how do you do that? You have to be willing to say, I don't have the answers. Maybe we have to create the answer to this adaptive problem. It's not a technical or formulaic problem where we say, okay, here's the problem, input this, and we're all fixed, right? I mean, if it's a technical challenge or a technical problem, I'm not sure you need leadership as the solution. When it's an adaptive problem, you need a secure leader who's willing to say, guys, I don't know, what are we going to do about this? And I actually work with someone who I really admire their ability, kind of like what Jen was talking about. I really admire how much they say, and by the way, this person is terribly bright, terribly smart, and yet without exception, they are great at collaborating and saying, okay, guys, what do we think here? What are we looking at? What's the problem? And they don't lose credibility over that. They actually gain credibility. The other thing I would suggest too for this intellectual stimulation, guys, it sounds kind of funny, but wherever you can, if you're trying to break yourself out of this rut, first of all, go to those who are closest. This is a term that I've adopted from someone, but go to those that are closest to delivery. Okay, think about that for a second, managers. Solicit the input of those that are closest to what we would call street level, that are actually doing the work and actually closest to interacting with customers. Solicit their opinions, because often we ignore that, and yet they have answers that are innovative and perspectives that we would have never had, right, if we didn't solicit their input. Okay. And whenever you can, appoint a devil's advocate. Now, a lot of you will say, hey, we've got a devil's advocate already. All they ever do is tell us all the things we're doing wrong. But I mean, appoint a devil's advocate to say, someone who will say, okay, tell us, if we weren't to do it this way, what's a better way of doing it? Okay. By the way, I can't believe I'm doing this. I've done this before, but kind of to Jen's point, I went to maybe a year and a half ago, so I went to Hale Theater and watched Newsies. I don't know why I'm embarrassed about that, but anyway, it was great. They did a great job. But one of the line, Catherine Plummer, who's the reporter who ends up helping the Newsies, had a line that I'm like, oh my gosh, I heard it, and I said to myself, I'm like, that's a leadership line. I need to use that. It says, being the boss doesn't mean you have all the answers, just the brains to recognize the right one when you hear it. And that's what Jen's talking about here. Go get others involved and help them to start solving these adaptive challenges that we face, right? Now, there are lots of books. In fact, we could have the Heifetz book or Heifetz books up here. But I would suggest, and there are a bunch of the Innovators series, Innovators Dilemma. I like the Innovators DNA because there are these 5 skills that you can easily master. But for being more innovative, for breaking up the status quo, these folks have some Utah ties as well, these authors, but they're at Harvard and other places now. Great, really readable, right, that you can check out now. So again, thanks, Jen, for that. Okay, last one here. Stay with us. We're almost through here. Is inspirational motivation. This is probably what we think of the most when we talk about leadership. This idea of, can you inspire people to achieve more than they could based on a vision of the future? Now, I am always reluctant to use the word vision because it puts pressure on leaders. Let's say I'm a frontline supervisor of a team of 5. I'm like, wait, I'm supposed to have the vision for that? Well, and so I appreciate the word purpose maybe a little bit more, but you demonstrate optimism. And high standards, meaning you set goals that challenge people, say, you guys, I think we can get here. And that in and of itself can stir people's motivations and their engagement. If you really believe it, if it's authentic, and you say, guys, I think we can be better than we were, here's how I see us. Probably, maybe the obvious answer here is the I Have a Dream speech from Martin Luther King Jr., right, August 1963. Partly I like that because of the high standards that he talked about in there, but also his use of metaphor and language. If you're going to engage people, narrative, story, metaphor to communicate the purpose that you see to their work is the way to do it. Now, this quote here from James McGregor Burns is probably the quote I've used most often in talking about leadership. And he says that it's inducing followers to act for goals that represent their values, their motivations, wants and needs, aspirations of. This is the vision, this is the purpose we're talking about. Their expectations of that shared purpose of both leaders and followers. And their genius lies in the manner in which they get people to act on those values, those motivations. And I'm just telling you, Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was a master of this. Now, here's the problem. You don't have to be able to be an orator like Martin Luther King Jr. to do this. We don't have to have that kind of charisma, but the use of symbol, metaphor, and narrative is absolutely critical. First of all, you have to know the purpose for yourself. Okay, leaders that are listening, you have to know, what is it that really matters here to me? What do we do here? In its purest form, why does the work that I do at UDOT or DWS or Trustlands or Health or Human Services or, you know, whatever, wherever it is, I left a bunch of agencies out, right? What is it that we do that matters? And once you find that authentically, then your task becomes, and it only works if you can authentically feel that. How can I best articulate that to people? And that's why the book I'm recommending for you here is the Secret Language of Leadership by Stephen Denning. And as you see, he's got other books, but it's this idea. Look at the title there, How Leaders Inspire Action Through Narrative. Effective leaders that inspire tend to be effective storytellers. You don't have to have a preacher's cadence. You don't have to be able to be charismatic, right? But you have to understand what grips people and what sticks with people. I remember an experience training, I think it was Region 1. I know the regions all compete with each other at UDOT, so I want to be very careful, but I think it was Region 1. And we went through this exercise in training of, okay, what do you do that matters? And the things that came out of there about, you know, I care about clearing the roads because I think about that mom trying to get her kids to school on a snowy, icy day, and I want her to be able to do it safely. Something as simple as that has stuck with me for over a decade now. I'm like, that's narrative to inspire people and give them purpose to their work. And this is something that you need to, again, I would solicit the help of the people that you're trying to lead. What is it that we do that matters? And then how can you articulate that for people? Are there narratives that you see? Are there metaphors that help it be relatable? But that's how you start to inspire people. So, okay, we just quickly went through the 4 I's, okay? And again, the order we went, of course, was individual consideration, idealized influence, intellectual stimulation, inspirational motivation. And here they are again, right? More fire hose. It's when you and I can adopt those more fully that we move from manager to leader, and leaders that actually, as we saw from the data, actually transform organizations. Think about what this means for the people you're trying to serve, the citizens of the state of Utah, the people within your agencies, even the employees that you're trying to lead, who you're trying to increase their engagement and job satisfaction. So the question you have to be asking yourself now is, how do I better increase my individual consideration on our team, the idealized influence that I might have? Am I actually being innovative? Am I allowing others to be innovative here? And am I inspiring them? Are we inspiring each other? Okay. Now, quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but are all leadership positions the same? Well, the data that you filled out says no. Now, stay with me here. Here you see the 4 I's on the left side there, proximal and distal. What do we mean by that? If I'm a frontline supervisor to someone, I am a proximal or close leader to them. If I am an executive director and I've got 1,000 people in my agency, employee number 1,000, I still need to be a leader to them, but I am a distal leader. Here's what some of the evidence from the survey that you filled out, many of you before this that we sent out. Here's what's interesting about this. Now, all of these matter, whether I'm a CEO or whether I'm a frontline supervisor. All 4 I's matter, but how they're executed and to the degree that they matter varies, okay? So you need to determine, first of all, for those that and every leader has proximal followers, whether you're a CEO or not. If you're a CEO, it's, you know, the other people in the C-suite or whatever, but not all leaders are distal leaders. Does that make sense? Okay, but everyone is proximal. Well, here's what the survey says. There's my Family Feud thing again. Individual consideration tends to matter more for proximal relationships. In other words, for a direct supervisor, I expect there to be individual consideration. I don't expect maybe the executive director to know my kids' names or my birthday or whatever it is, but I do expect it maybe of my frontline supervisor. Okay. Intellectual stimulation, we usually, or at least we more expect that from distal leaders. Okay. In proximal leaders, here's what's interesting. We expect intellectual stimulation in terms of how we do tasks. Okay? But we tend to expect it more of distal leaders. Again, these matter for everybody, every kind of leader, okay? Inspirational motivation, if you had to guess, where do you think it probably comes from? I know you can't answer, it's rhetorical. Well, we kind of expect that more from distal because we think of visions and vision statements. We think of the presidents or Steve Jobs or CEOs or, but again, this matters for proximal leaders too. And we just talked about how. We just talked about how. Idealized influence, interestingly enough, mattered for both equally. In other words, reported over and over. And we've done the survey with other respondents too. So we have your data and their data and both validate the same thing. It says, we want examples and credibility and trust and people to walk the talk from both proximal and distal leaders if we're going to be followers to them. Okay, just kind of interesting from your survey data there. So in closing here, I want you to think about two questions. And really all of leadership studies kind of come down to these two things. How would your employees, right, people that are employees or potential followers, how would they respond to these two statements? Ask yourself this, okay? This leader, you listening here, this leader cares about me as a person, and this leader cares deeply about the work that we do. You guys, since leadership studies became a formal field, these two concepts of people and task, the work and relationships, has been the dichotomy of leadership and management studies since the early 20th century. Now, we give it different names, we talk about it in different ways, but down to its bare bones, I'm telling you right now, if your employees can answer in the affirmative that, yes, this leader cares about me as a person, and this leader cares deeply about the work that we do, you are in a position to be an effective, authentic, transformational leader. These two questions answered in the affirmative will do more for you than all these seminars that you go to and other things, but you have to be constantly working on this. You have to be constantly being like, how am I doing in those two areas? And this is where the 4 I's can be fit into these two things, right? So ask yourself that question. And if you're confident, if you're comfortable, and there's enough trust, ask your people, how am I doing with this? I just want to share one more thing with you. Regardless of your politics, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away recently, and I don't know that she and I agree on everything politically or agreed on everything politically, but I heard this quote that Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave, and I said, well, that's pretty good for transformational leadership, which is fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. Same thing applies in organizations. She's probably talking more civically or politically, but you got to have things that you care about in the first place if you're going to be an authentic transformational leader. And then you got to fight for it. You got to be about it, right? But you got to do it in a way, think individual consideration and idealized influence. You got to do it in a way that others will want to join you, okay? That they'll say, yeah, okay, I want to be a part of that, right? Okay, guys, 2 weeks from today, we've got similar, this leadership topics. Rick Murdoch, who you guys have heard from him, you've loved his webinar so far. He's going to talk about, we get feedback from you, right? And overwhelmingly, we want to hear about motivation. How do you motivate people? Well, he's going to talk about a very specific way to motivate people. How do you design tasks and assignments so that it actually motivates people? So 2 weeks from today, October 21st, 10 a.m., you see there on the screen what he's going to talk about specifically. I think this is one that you're going to want to take notes for, right? Where it's going to help you actually delegate and assign people things in a way that inherently enhances their motivation. And I mean, that's just awesome, right? So 2 weeks from today, 10 a.m., Rick Murdoch's going to take you through that. You guys, we've talked about a lot today, the 4 I's of transformational leadership. Jen talked about it being a fire hose. As you know, these are recorded. What you see there, we're going to send you out a survey for this, and also once we get it rendered, we'll send you the recording of this, and in that you'll also have the recording of all the other off-the-shelf series that we've done. Review them if it's helpful. Reach out to us if you have questions. Our passion at DHRM and our leadership development unit is helping you develop your leadership. And hopefully we've talked about some things today, regardless of pandemic, regardless of virtual settings, will help you become a more effective leader. So fill out that survey if you would, go check out the recordings, and thanks for your time, everybody.